Hey everybody, I'm recording this because we probably are not going to have campus being open tomorrow or Thursday. I'm going to go ahead and post this in Blackboard. So if campus is open, this will be available. If campus is not open, watch this and take notes. Anyway, some of my classes were just about to get to the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, and in one of the other classes we had already covered this. It's about 5 minutes, so I'm going to just go ahead and cover this, and then I'm going to move forward, and then everybody will get to the same spot. I don't have my notes with me, so we're just kind of winging this, except for the two court cases at the end. I've written some new notes on there, so I've got those, but outside of that, but we'll be cool. You just don't kill me for the exact numbers, because I don't remember exactly on some of the voting, registered voters and stuff like that. But we'll be good. So, anyway, to kind of pick up where some of the classes left off, now President Andrew Johnson is serving as a roadblock for all of the stuff that the radical Republicans were wanting. Remember, they had input the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and passed that over Johnson's veto, and then because that could be reversed, they sort of repackaged that into the 14th Amendment. And that's one of the Reconstruction amendments. We'll get to the other Reconstruction amendment here in a little bit. Go away. There we go. Sorry. And so since Johnson is also, pardoning those high-ranking ex-Confederates, the radical Republicans want to get rid of this guy. We've got to remove him from office, and so that they can move forward. And definitely they want to prevent that creation of that old South society, which is happening right when we're going down this way. And so Johnson helps out unknowingly the radical Republicans. He fires the Secretary of War. Secretary of War is a guy named Edwin Stanton. That's a picture of Mr. Stanton there. These two guys do not at all get along. And Andrew Johnson fires Stanton. Well, when he does this, and get this down because this law tends to show up on exams, when Johnson did that, he violated a really obscure law that's only recent, called the Tenure of Office Act. And it's kind of funny because Andrew Johnson actually signed this into law a little bit earlier. And the Tenure of Office Act basically says that you have to consult or get approval from Congress to fire a member of the president's cabinet. And Johnson didn't do that. And so this is, this law is, it was undone. It was, a later Congress gets rid of this law. But this is a very minor thing. So this is definitely a misdemeanor. To be impeached and removed from office, a president has to commit high crimes or misdemeanors. Well, this is a misdemeanor. It's a very small infraction. But Congress is going to use this to try to get rid of Andrew Johnson. So the House of Representatives brings formal charges. That's impeachment. So Andrew Johnson was impeached. Then it goes to the United States Senate, and that's where you see the trial. Andrew Johnson goes on trial. He does make a big deal about this. He really tries to walk this back. He promises not to be a roadblock for the radical Republicans. I mean, he's really kind of trying to dance around and get out of this. I don't know if that was effective or not, but the United States Senate does fail to convict Andrew Johnson by one single vote. And so here's a really big important point. Johnson is still president. He is not convicted. He's still president. But here's the big thing. He's basically lost all political power. if he does anything else, if he continues to serve as a roadblock to Reconstruction, they're going to probably be able to convince one person to change their vote, and Johnson will be removed. And so he's still president. He'll serve out the rest of his term, but he's basically a non-entity. And a big thing is now Congress is going to step up and really take control of Reconstruction. And so Tenure of Office Act basically strips Andrew Johnson of any kind of political power. He's going to go and hang out in the second floor of the White House, eating gummy bears and reading comic books, which sounds cool. But he's going to do that for the rest of his term, basically. No political power for the most part. Congress is going to take control of Reconstruction. Now we're in that second stage of Reconstruction, that about 67-ish to 1876. After Congress kind of knocks Andrew Johnson on the head, they're going to pass the third Reconstruction Amendment. So first Reconstruction Amendment's the 13th Amendment, abolishes slavery. Second is the 14th, gives everybody citizenship. 15th Amendment is a voting rights amendment. 15th Amendment prohibits denying the right to vote on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Does not mention gender at all. So we're definitely leaving out women here, and this is going to give the women's rights movement a big kind of shot in the arm, that a lot of, especially white women, after the war and after the 15th Amendment comes into play, African American men are able to vote, and a lot of white women are, pretty incensed about this. Some of them are upset about granting these African American men the right to vote, but also some of them are also like, hey, it's been legal to educate us. We have been citizens for a very long time. We deserve suffrage. We deserve, ability to speak out in the government, stuff like that. So there's a big boon kind of to the civil right, or the women's rights movement. This does kind of cool give birth to a couple of different women's rights groups. The American, you don't have to remember which one of these does which, but I do want to get that there is a difference. The American Equal Rights Association is going to be one that tries to convince a lot of politicians, but the rest of the country, that the right thing to do is now to include women in the right to vote. So they're going to kind of go on this moral persuasion sort of thing, that this is the right thing to do. We need to expand the vote to everybody in the United States. That is, right now the voting age is like 21 and up. So we need to expand that to everybody. And they're going to try to do this sort of, moral suasion. This is the right thing to do. The National Women's Suffrage Association is going to be a lot more aggressive, though. They're going to be a lot more demanding. They are going to go out and actively break laws and commit protests and stuff like that. I'm looking for something. And so they're going to go out and do protests and stuff. A big one in 1905, I'm pretty sure. Don't have my notes on, but pretty sure it's 1905. A group from the National Women's Suffrage Association stages a protest outside of the White House. They are standing on the sidewalk along Pennsylvania Avenue. And they're on the sidewalk. They're not out there in the street, which protests sometimes spill into the street. Sometimes, that's the way to get attention. But they're definitely on the sidewalk. They're not in the way. And they're trying to get the attention of Woodrow Wilson to try to, speak out and get the attention to give sort of suffrage a voice more. Sorry, I'm rambling a little. And they're arrested for impeding traffic. They were on the sidewalk. They weren't blocking the street or anything, but still, the the authorities can do that. They were arrested for impeding traffic. They go to the Washington District Jail. Part of this, the whole thing was that they were trying to get attention for the cause, and so getting arrested for this, hey, that helps out. That brings more attention to the struggle for suffrage. So when they get to the jail, they decide to go on a hunger strike. Also, it's going to get more attention for this effort for suffrage, and they decide to go on a hunger strike. And the jailers at first try to force feed them, and that works a little bit. They're going to kind of blend up some sort of meals and pour it down them. That works a little bit, but one of the strongest muscles in your body is your jaw muscle. If you clamp your jaw closed, another person's going to have a hard time getting that open. And so these women figure that out pretty quickly, that they can just clamp their jaws closed and the jailers cannot force feed them anymore. And so, this gets more attention, that these women are refusing. Absolutely. They're on a hunger strike and the jailers are trying to feed them, and they're absolutely, fighting back against that. Well, this is going to sound weird, but that would be a really bad look for the jail. It would be a bad look for Washington, D.C., for the United States government, if one of these women were to starve to death or really started getting emaciated during this effort at force feeding. And so they can't really allow these women to just starve themselves completely and terrible state if one of them actually dies. And so the jail administrators decide that there is a method that they can still feed these women. And so they strap them down onto chairs so that they can't move, and they pull their head back and strap their heads down. And again, that muscle in your jaw, you can't force somebody to open that. If they're not going to be able to. So the jailers instead use a flexible tube, and this is 1905, so rubber tubes probably aren't as soft as they are today. They're a lot more squishy. So don't try this. Never ever try anything like this. This is just what is happening in this situation. So the jailers are tying these women down, and they take these rubber tubes and stick them up their noses, and your nasal cavity opens up and goes down into your esophagus. Scary part is your esophagus then splits and goes into your lungs or your stomach. If you go the wrong way, you're going to pour a lot of soup in somebody's lungs. And so they're, shoving these rubber tubes up these women's noses into their stomachs, and then force feeding them that way. So a lot of women were force fed through their noses in a really, really brutal fashion to try to get the right to vote. And I always really go kind of detailed there, because when it comes time to vote, you need to go vote. I don't care if you're a guy or a girl or whatever, whoever you are in my class. People went through some really tough situations in order to get universal suffrage in the United States, and you really need to take advantage of that. I kind of go a little further and say you should probably feel bad if you don't go vote. I don't care who you vote for. Yeah, but you should feel a little bit off if you don't go vote, because some people really went through some horrible situations to make sure you could vote. So, anyway, election of 1868. Andrew Johnson is sitting out. He is wildly unpopular. And so the Republican Party is going to go with Ulysses S. Grant. You don't have to remember that he runs for president in 68. He is an ineffective president. He's a military commander. He's not really politically savvy that well. I mean, he does some cool stuff, but his administration's also plagued with a lot of scandals because he just wasn't that person. He's not really a political entity. And so a lot of people kind of took advantage of that. People in his administration kind of went wild a little bit. But the cool thing with the election of 68 is that for the first time that African American men were able to vote, they actually swung this election. In the South, a coalition of Southern white Republicans, there's not a lot of those, but there are some, and there's some Northern people that are moving south, as well as the African American vote, are going to sway this election. And for the first time that African American men were able to vote in a national election, that voting bloc made a substantial difference. In addition to Grant being elected, nearly 2,000 African Americans were elected to office. I think this is a part where I don't have my notes, and so I'm like, and I didn't look this up. I should have looked it up, but I think 14 at least African American men were elected to the United States House of Representatives. 2 African American men were elected to the United States Senate. Both of those were out of Mississippi. And this is huge. This is a very huge number. The next couple of slides, we're going to undo a lot of this progress that we've made over the last couple of slides in the last 2 lectures here. And we really don't get to that number, that 2,000 African Americans elected to, various offices, state, local, national offices. We don't get to that again until 1992. This number drops off dramatically here in a second, and it takes a long time to get back. It's not until, like I said, 1992. I was a junior in high school, so this stuff has recent ramifications. So holy cow, Southern white folks, a lot of Southern white folks, not all, but a lot of Southern white folks are like, oh my gosh, African American men have the vote. They are making changes. We have got to do something about that. We have got to counter this and step this down. Couple of things are going to go down. One, very shortly after the Civil War, the Klan is established in Pulaski, Tennessee. A group of about 6 former Confederates are going to meet up, and that building, the white building there beneath the Knucklehead Klansmen, that white building up in Pulaski, it's a little bit off of the courthouse square. 6 ex-Confederates met in that building and are going to establish the Ku Klux Klan. This is a terrorist organization. Its objective at the time is to try to basically terrorize African Americans as well as white Republicans in the South into not voting and not having any political power. Other places will have similar organizations. The Klan kind of spreads out, but some other places are, Louisiana, instead of the Klan, they start something called the Knights of the White Camellia. Don't have to remember that. It's just another, racist terrorist organization kind of a thing. But they're going to really try to kind of, stomp down the African American vote and terrorize people. That particular image of those Klansmen was just the goofiest picture of Klansmen that I could find. If I ever find a dumber picture of Klansmen, I'll probably replace that one. But those people are just dumbasses. Sorry, cussing a little. Cool thing though, and you do need to get this down. Sometimes this shows up on the test. So right there, see this sort of, it's almost a black square. That is a historical marker by the state of Tennessee. And you see these on signposts and stuff as you're driving around. There's one a little bit to the north of there's actually 2 to the north of campus. One's, I think, a skirmish that went on there. Another one is one of the historic homes that's on the side of the road between campus and Athens. But the state puts this up. When you get one of these, I think I'm assuming parts, it's a state law that you know, definitely have to put this up. And so a lawyer up in Pulaski bought that building because it is close to the courthouse square. And so it's a nice place for an office. A lawyer bought that building a couple of decades ago. And the state sent that historical marker because, you know, yes, the Klan is a terrorist organization, horrible bunch of knuckleheads, but, you know, that building is a significant historical location, and yes, we should recognize that, you know, good or bad, these historical locations do exist, and they should, you know, if something happened there, hey, you know, put a marker up there that you know, notes what happened objectively. And so the state sent this out, and, you know, you know, you have to mount it to the side of the building or something. You have to prominently, you know, you have to display it somehow. And so he didn't want his building to be sort of this pilgrimage for a bunch of racists. He didn't want a bunch of Klans people showing up there, you know, all excited for the birthplace of the Klan and stuff. And so he was, you know, legally obligated to put this historical marker on display. And so instead of dropping stuff, instead of you know, putting it up there where you could read the text, I'm not sure, I can't see my own camera right now. Instead of putting it up there where you could read the text, he mounted it to the back of the sign to the wall. So the text is facing the brick wall, and, you know, the back of the plaque is just blank, and it's mounted on the building like he's legally obligated to do. So that's kind of a cool sort of jab, I guess, sideways slap, something, thumb in the eye toward the Klan. He just kind of put it on there backwards. So, but unfortunately, the Klan is very effective in, you know, pushing down African American votes. And even though there's progress during the Reconstruction years with the expansion of African American rights, we're going to get to the election of 1876. The Republicans are going to run Rutherford B. Hayes. The Democrats, you don't have to remember, are going to run Samuel Tilden. This election on both sides was just absolutely troubled with all sorts of voting irregularities, lots and lots of fraud. Much cooler historian than me, a guy named David Blight, teaches up at Yale. He said that the Democrats stole the election in 1876, and then the Republicans stole it back. So both sides were stuffing ballot boxes. Both sides were stealing ballot boxes of opposition voters. And after all the counting was done, Rutherford B. Hayes did win the election. It was very, very close, but several states, honestly, had so many voting irregularities that there was a discussion and consideration of possibly redoing the election. That probably wouldn't have solved anything because people would have just been more desperate and, you know, had more voting irregularities. And so what the two political parties decided to do is that the Democrats would accept Rutherford B. Hayes as president, but they wanted several things in return. So they would not object to Rutherford B. Hayes being sworn in as president, but the Democratic Party, especially the Southern Democratic Party, wanted several things in return. And there's a decent list. You don't have to get the first ones down, but some of the stuff they wanted, and a lot of it's, you know, legit. They wanted a southern branch to the Transcontinental Railroad. There was one branch up north already, or it was kind of in the middle of the country. They wanted a southern branch of the Transcontinental Railroad. They wanted more funding for barriers along the Mississippi River, because the Mississippi would regularly in the springtime overflood her banks. And so they wanted, basically the United States Army Corps of Engineers to erect barriers along to reinforce the banks of the Mississippi River so that hopefully, they would kind of hold her in her banks. They wanted a Democrat on Hayes's cabinet. I don't remember. It's probably Secretary of the Interior at the time, not a very prominent position. But the big thing that they do want, this is one to scribble down because holy cow, it's super important. They wanted removal of federal troops from the South. United States military troops have, since the end of the Civil War, still been stationed throughout the United States South. So it's basically the South is under a military occupation. And the Democrats, the Southern Democratic Party, wants the removal of those troops. Now, don't have to get this down, but a lot of Northern families and a lot of these soldiers too, they were kind of okay with this. There's a couple of reasons. This is now 11 years after the Civil War, so they've been an occupying military force for 11 years, and so we're not just going to like, hey, you're in the South for all 11 years, but a lot of these soldiers are experiencing time away from their families and stuff like that. And so, that gets old. The United States has had soldiers deployed to Afghanistan until very, very recently, almost 20 years, over 20 years after 9/11. There's still troops stationed in Iraq, and there were, not a lot anymore, I don't think, but there were still quite a lot for a long time until recently. That's been more of a drawdown. And a lot of Americans, 20 years, that's a long time to constantly have American troops there. And so a lot of Americans kind of have lost the desire to keep those guys there, men and women, sorry. So, that's been 20 years. And so same thing here, Northern families and people are just wanting those, especially this time, those guys to come back home. And so they're not really that objecting to that removal of troops. Also, there's a little bit of a notion of if the South hasn't got it together in 11 years after the war, they're not gonna. And so, maybe it's time to just kind of get done with this. So the removal of federal troops from the South, that does a big thing, though. Those federal troops were enforcing Reconstruction. They were requiring that Southern locations allow African American men to vote. They were enforcing the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, trying to keep the Klan in check a little bit and stuff. And when those federal troops go away, that enforcement doesn't happen anymore. And so the federal troops are removed from the South. Reconstruction's done. Reconstruction is ended at that point. And a group of mostly ex-Confederate, but a lot of former politicians and a lot of emerging politicians, because this is 11 years later, are going to start calling themselves Redeemers, and they will start running for Southern state legislatures, and they'll take control of Southern states. And they kind of sell this as we are redeeming the South from, sort of Northern oppression, in their words. And so they're going to start undoing most of what's happened during Reconstruction. And so kind of take a little aside here. For the last 11 years, there's been a massive, wonderful expansion of rights in the South, especially for African Americans. Lots of African Americans have been elected to local and national office. African Americans have been having voting rights. They've been largely protected from a lot of violence, some violence, not all violence. But that is going away. very, very quickly once these guys come back into control. And so there's like this sort of big step forward, but it's 3 steps back here in a second. So once the Redeemers take control of Southern governments, a big thing that they've got to do, that they feel like they've got to do anyway, is they've definitely got to eliminate the African American vote. The African American vote is getting African Americans elected to Congress, to state legislatures. One African American guy was governor of Louisiana for about a month, but there was some massive progress, and that's got to be undone from the perspective of a lot of white Southern Democrats. And so remember the 15th Amendment. We just passed the 15th Amendment. We say we can't deny someone the right to vote based on race, creed, or previous condition of servitude. So we can't eliminate the black vote by just saying African American people can't vote. That's illegal. But we're going to do it through dancing around it and kind of being very creative on, eliminating the black vote, basically. I'm going to run through all of these. Do get them down. This loves to show up as a multiple choice question. It's one of those questions, Southern whites do all of the following to eliminate the African American vote, except, So, and we'll actually have some court cases later that actually undo a lot of these, thankfully. So, one of them is something called the white man's primary. Today in 2024, Alabama is a single party state, right? Kay Ivey is currently the governor. She's a Republican. I don't know if she's going to run again. I think she's hinted that she probably won't. I'm not really sure. But, whoever, though, right now that whoever we elect for governor next time, whenever the next election cycle for governor rolls around, it's going to be a Republican, right? It's very, very low odds that Alabama is going to elect a Democrat for governor right now because we are a single party state. You do have different, districts in Alabama that do elect Democrats, but as a whole, we're a solidly red state. Texas is the same way. Texas is, going to elect a Republican governor. So, since that's the case, no, never mind. Since that's the case, the general election, where we, run the two parties against each other, Democrats versus Republicans, that's kind of an afterthought. We already know who's going to be the winner of that, right? So the primary, where we decide who the Democratic candidate is, or we decide who the Republican candidate is, that is the more important election in this situation, right? Definitely go vote, okay? I'm not trying to talk you out of this, definitely. But in those single party states, the primary election is the more important election, because whoever you get for, you're going to elect a Republican governor in Alabama. So it's the primary election where you decide which Republican governor among the several Republican candidates. That's the important one. So in Texas as well as Alabama, but Texas will actually have a court case that fixes this later. Both of those states, and other states too, but I definitely know Alabama and Texas do this, are going to start something called the white man's primary. That they are going to say that, look, we can't deny African Americans the right to vote in the general election, but we're not going to allow them to vote in the more important primary election. And since the primary election is the more important one, we are only going to allow white people to vote in there. And they'll argue that, look, this isn't the general election. We're not denying anybody the right to vote, on actual elections. We're just not allowing people in our club, So that's one of the methodologies. The other one we talked about before, we had violence with the Klan. The Klan is going to threaten violence. Other groups, rifle clubs, the Knights of the White Camellia, all that kind of stuff are just going to, hey, we will kill you, or we will threaten to kill you if you try to go and vote. And that works. It does scare a lot of people away from the polls, unfortunately. Another one that is really, really horribly crafty are grandfather clauses. Again, we can't say someone's not allowed to vote based on race. So, several states will put into place what are called grandfather clauses. You are only allowed to vote if your grandfather could vote. Okay, that sounds kind of weird, but all right. But, for Southern white dudes in 1875, say, when this comes about, their grandfathers were voting prior to the Civil War. They were able to vote, right? White dudes prior to the Civil War were able to vote. In the South, African American grandfathers prior to the Civil War, a lot of those folks were enslaved. And even if they weren't, free African Americans prior to the Civil War were not allowed to vote. And so what we've done is said, hey, white or black, you're only allowed to vote if your grandfather could vote. Well, I'm not saying it has to do with race, but it does have to do with race. I feel like that Ancient Aliens guy. And so that's another methodology. Alabama employs this one as well. I'm pretty sure that Louisiana and Arkansas, and I believe Texas does. Lots of states will employ a lot of these different ones, because if you have them overlapping, you can kind of make sure that you eliminate, especially the African American vote. So grandfather clauses is another methodology. Literacy tests, most people have heard of those. Again, we talked about this the other day in class, that African Americans, especially after the Civil War, are really going to jump on, learning to read and write. And so this is somewhat effective, because it does take several decades to get African American literacy on par with white literacy. But, different states will have, Alabama, Louisiana, I definitely know of, does these, will set up a literacy test, and if you have to give it to everybody, then they'll give white people a very simple sort of reader, kind of a Dick and Jane, like second grade sort of thing. And then African American people will get like a section of the Constitution, explain the emoluments clause, read this big chunk of the Constitution, which if you sit down and read that, it's like, I don't know what that means. You really have to kind of parse through it and stuff, but it's enough to trip people up. And so literacy tests eliminates a lot. Also poll taxes. Remember, African Americans are largely sharecroppers. They don't have any cash on hand right now, but poll taxes gets rid of a lot of the African American vote, and also it gets rid of a lot of the very, very poor white vote as well. And so there's a little bit of, gotta be careful that we don't kind of create sort of a commonality between, poor African Americans and poor white people. So there's, you'll see some of the slogans like that'll pop up, this is white man's country, let white men rule, sort of thing, that you've got the white elite sort of reaching out to the poor people that can come up with a poll tax. Look, yeah, we may be of economic super huge economic differences, but there's this kind of commonality that both parties are white, and so they really try to kind of reinforce that sort of white commonality between the two groups. So, but all of these methodologies, though, are really going to work horribly well to eliminate the African American vote. I think in 1896 in Mississippi, there were somewhere in the neighborhood of a couple of thousand, maybe 300,000 African Americans registered to vote in Mississippi in 1896. Mississippi puts in a lot of these efforts, these laws to eliminate the black vote. And in 1905, I think that's right, 1905, there were 5,000 African Americans in Mississippi that were registered to vote. And so all of these things work horribly, horribly well in removing the black vote from being any kind of political power. So, and that's going to be that way until about the 1960s. So we'll get there, but it's gonna, for a very long time from right now, there is not really much of a political voice for African Americans in the South. That has largely been eliminated. So, gonna have a couple of court cases here. These are interesting in a couple of ways. So, first up is a court case from 1873. This is where I actually have notes. So this is kind of a neat one because there's several different weird things going on. So this is a dispute between the state of Louisiana, the city, and the city of New Orleans, both on the same team here, and they're confronting the butchering trade basically in New Orleans. And what's going on is that the butchers, there we go. There's my cursor. The butchers have been located kind of in the northern part of the city, up here, a little bit in from Lake Pontchartrain, and some of them have been up here along the upper. Actually, I think most of them are up here along the upper part of the Mississippi River. And decent map of New Orleans here. This is the main city. Up here is Lake Pontchartrain. We talked about this, like I mentioned, Lake Pontchartrain the other day. Mississippi River flows down through here, and there's a couple of, sort of islands, I guess, if you want to call them that, down here. And then we get down here to the Gulf of Mexico. I tried to kind of get this all sort of on a decent bit of the slide. That's kind of why it looks sort of weird. But the butchers, some of them are located up here along Lake Pontchartrain. There's a couple of canals that run through here, but a lot of the butchers are up in the northern part of the city. And they have been taking in somewhere in the neighborhood, this is really impressive, somewhere in the neighborhood of 300,000 head of cattle per year and processing them up there in the northern part of the city. So they're killing these cattle, they're butchering them and sending the meat, all through the city. And that's great. Steak is delicious. But here's the problem. They're to the north of the city, right? So they're they're upriver of the city. And as they process all of these cattle, they are just throwing what's called the offal. You don't have to remember the term, but it's OFFAL. All of the blood, all of the dung that the cattle excrete after they're killed, all of the organ meat, a lot of the hooves and bones, just the stuff that most folks are not using, that stuff's just going to get pitched into the river, right? Because why not, right? It's going to go into the river, and eventually it'll go out to the ocean. It'll be fine. No one cares. Okay. Well, New Orleans gets its drinking water from the river. And so if you are dumping a bunch of offal up here to the north of the city, upriver into the river, and then you've got pumping stations down here below the river, when these pumping stations pump water into the city for people to consume, it's going to have all of this stuff in it, right? There's going to be cow dung. There's going to be organ meat that is rotting. There's going to be cow blood and stuff. There's going to be all kinds of funky stuff in your water that you are going to drink. And so the city really has been working for years to try, please, holy cow, they really want to convince the butchering operations to move down here below the city. This is probably a little bit further than they want. The cities, this is a more recent map, but the city definitely wasn't this large at the time, but they're wanting to move all the butchering operations down about 1.5 miles below where they are, and a little bit below, downriver from the city. So this way, when you process all of this meat and you chuck all stuff in the river, it's not above the city and going into everybody's drinking water. And so they've been trying to convince them to do that. And New Orleans is a sick city. It's called a necropolis, a city of the dead, for a reason. There's all kinds of yellow fever. There's all kinds of cholera. So the city planners, administrators are trying to convince these butchers, you got to move south. Please, you're making this gross. And they've been trying to do this for a long time. In 1869, the state is going to pass a law, and they require the butchers to form something called, and it's up there, the Crescent City Livestock Landing and Slaughterhouse Company. And what they're going to do is they will set up a warehouse below the city, downriver of the city. Every butcher has to, if you want to work as a butcher in New Orleans, you have to rent a stall in this warehouse. You process meat there. Nobody else is allowed to process meat in New Orleans. And anybody can. And they will, if you're already a butcher in New Orleans, they will make sure that you can rent a stall, and they're not going to rip you off. Now, this is a cool thing, but this is 1869. The state legislature in New Orleans is democratically controlled, actually by Republicans. Sorry. Southern states as a whole were controlled by the Democrats prior to the Civil War. Well, for a long time, those ex-Confederates, Southern Democrats, were, controlling the state houses and stuff like that. But a lot of them haven't taken that oath of allegiance. They haven't gotten their voting rights back. And so Republicans are, especially with African American vote, are holding on to the state legislatures. And so the Republican-controlled state legislature passes this law. Well, the people of New Orleans, because this is a Republican proposed law, this is the other party, the opposition party, they actually fight this. And they support the butchers when the butchers file a lawsuit. The butchers file a lawsuit, challenge this in the state. The state Supreme Court says, we agree with the state legislature. We're going to uphold this law, so it gets up to the Supreme Court. On the test, I refer to these cases as the slaughterhouse cases. There's a series of court cases where they're trying to fight this. It gets decided by the Supreme Court in 1873. The full name of this court case, which does not show up on the test, but if you're just curious, this is the Butchers Benevolent Association of New Orleans versus the Crescent City Livestock Landing and Slaughterhouse Corporation. Now, here's the thing. This is where this case gets kind of weird and interesting. The Butchers Benevolent Association is going to file a lawsuit, and they're going to claim that, one, this is a monopoly because everybody has to contract with the Crescent City Livestock Corporation. It's not because you're renting a stall there. It's just we're locating this for public health reasons. It's not a monopoly, but that's what they're saying. They're also, this is a really, really big thing because most of the people, not all of them, but a very clear majority, most of the Butchers Benevolent Association are a bunch of white dudes, but they're going to claim that this, the law that creates this thing and forces them all to go down here is a violation of the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment gets rid of slavery. They're going to say that this is creating a system akin to indentured servitude, and neither slavery nor indentured servitude is legal within the United States except as a form of punishment or something like that. I forget how the 13th is actually worded. So they're claiming that this amendment that was originally intended to free African American slaves is violating their rights because that kind of creates an indentured servitude situation. They also, on top of this, and this is a lot of detail, I know, but it's just kind of wild that what they're doing here. They're also going to claim that it violates the 14th Amendment because the 14th Amendment has the Equal Protection Clause. They're saying that, look, I'm a butcher, I'm being singled out. You're not singling out shoemakers. You're not singling out cobblers. You're not singling out other, candlestick makers. You're not singling out other trades. You're just singling out our trade, and that's a violation of equal protection under the law. Not really at all, but that's what they're going to claim. Now, here's something really, 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 really important that comes out of the slaughterhouse cases, okay? Is that we have this thing today called incorporation. The first 10 amendments at the time that they were written only applied to the federal government. And so the federal government could not interfere with your First Amendment rights, your free speech rights. The federal government can't interfere with your Second Amendment rights, your ability to, bear arms. The state governments, they don't have those restrictions at all. Right now, lots and lots of state governments are passing laws that, hey, African Americans, you guys can't have firearms. Other people, you guys can't have firearms either. State governments don't have those restrictions. It's just when the founders set this up, the Constitution, the first 10 amendments, only applies to the federal government. Later, like in the 1920s, so we have about 50 years, later the Supreme Court will do something called incorporating the Bill of Rights. They'll start applying the Bill of Rights and those and other amendments too to state governments. They'll say, look, we originally, when the Bill of Rights was created, we were more concerned about the federal government kind of treading on people, if you want to use that phrase. Now we're kind of seeing after the Civil War that we need to watch out for state governments too. State governments are kind of, stomping on people's rights as well. And so the Supreme Court will start incorporating state governments into those things. The United States Supreme Court, though, will decide the slaughterhouse cases with a 5-4 decision. Big thing they're going to do is they're going to really go with I know I'm throwing a lot of Supreme Court kind of stuff at you. They're going to go with an originalism kind of argument. And then this is a bunch of, today we kind of, most people are like originalists are kind of sort of knuckleheads because we've expanded, the way we think about these things. But the court in a 5-4 decision, so very close, is going to argue that, look, the 13th Amendment, that was written to apply to freeing African American enslaved people. That's all it was meant to do, nothing else. So it definitely doesn't apply to a bunch of butchers down in New Orleans. They're also going to look at the 14th Amendment. They're going to say, look, that doesn't also have anything to do with you. And also, on top of, equal protection under the law on the trades things, on top of that, the 14th Amendment only applies to the federal government. And here's the big kicker with the slaughterhouse cases. The Supreme Court says that state governments can do whatever they want. So state governments do not have to, we're going to test the 14th Amendment right here. State governments don't have to abide by the 14th Amendment. Equal protection under the law? Not really. Don't worry about it. That'll get reversed, thankfully. And a lot of actually kind of rights that a lot of different groups enjoy today are an expansion of the 14th Amendment. Very, very cool. So, the 14th Amendment is basically neutralized because of the slaughterhouse cases. That's a big thing to scribble down. 14th Amendment is basically neutralized because of the slaughterhouse cases. The Supreme Court says 14th Amendment only applies to the federal government. This is the state government that is, violating your equal protection under the law here, butchers, and they're allowed to do that. So today this wouldn't fly. Today, a lot of legal scholars and even probably most of the current Supreme Court would argue that no, 14th Amendment equal protection applies to everybody. State governments versus federal doesn't matter. So, but this is a big thing. We'll have some more incorporation stuff later on. That's really, really cool. That's a positive thing. So last slide for this lecture, and I'm not going to cover the benevolent associations right now. So another court case also down in New Orleans. But by the way, sorry. Back to slaughterhouse cases. Slaughterhouse cases are going to allow state governments can pass laws, kind of restricting the rights of African Americans, and the Supreme Court's not going to do anything about it. So neutralizes the 14th Amendment from the perspective of the states. States can do what they want. Federal government's really the only one that's kind of restricted on the 14th for right now. So a couple of years later, we have got another really, really important court case that's going to have some huge, huge impact. This is Plessy versus Ferguson. The United States Supreme Court's going to hand down this decision in 1896. This one's kind of a weird one also because the rail owners are actually not really in support of this law for a logical reason. And, so anyway, when does this pass? 1890. 1890. Louisiana is going to pass a law called the Separate Rail Car Act. Separate Rail Car Act says that railroad companies cannot put African American passengers in the same rail car as white passengers. You have to have two separate rail cars for African American passengers and white passengers. There is an exception if a white family has an African American nurse that is taking care of the children. That nurse is allowed to ride in the white rail car. That's the only exception to this. All other African Americans have to ride in the African American rail car, not allowed in the white car. What's kind of funny, though, is this is actually unpopular with the railroad companies, because the railroad companies previously, if you have, a limited amount of rail cars for passengers, and mostly you're calling freight or something like that, you could stick everybody in one car, right? Now with this law, the railroad companies have to have two separate rail cars. They have to have an additional car for African American passengers and then white passengers. That's extra weight. It's an extra car. You would rather be hauling freight or something like that. It's just an aggravation, and it costs money. And so the railroad companies actually don't really support this. It's kind of cool that profits are trumping racism here. I'm sure that the railroad companies are probably like not really that in support of having everybody on equal rights. It's just, dollars and cents kind of a thing for them. So this law is not really popular with the railroad companies, but it's also not, as you would expect, popular at all with African Americans, as well as a very tiny number of white folks in New Orleans. There's actually some white people that get involved with this that are not in support and try to fight it. And so a group forms, and they are going to form a group to try to fight this law. They're going to violate the law and then take it to court. And so they hit up a African American guy named Homer Plessy, and that is a picture of Homer Plessy in the image there. Homer Plessy will later on, when he gets onto the car, tell the ticket taker that he is 1/8 black. So he's 7/8 white. He's had, I think he says he has one grandparent that was African American. So he very, very much looks white. He definitely could pass for white, but a lot of southern communities, a lot of southern states have this goofy idea of the one drop rule. If you have one drop of African American blood flowing through you, then you are African American. Doesn't really matter what you look like or anything. So Homer Plessy looks like he's white pretty much, but he has African American ancestry, and so by stupid logic, he's actually black. We have weird ideas on race. So anyway, so they hit up Homer Plessy to challenge the law, and so he buys a ticket for the white car. You buy a ticket for the black car, you buy a ticket for the white car. So he buys a ticket for the white car. He gets on board the train starts, the ticket taker comes around, and when the ticket guy comes around, Homer Plessy gives him his ticket, and he says that, hey, I am 1/8 African American. And the guy orders him to leave the car. Mr. Plessy is arrested, and he's charged with violating the Separate Car Act. Kind of cool, and you don't have to get this down. The group that actually was formed to challenge the law, they hired a private detective to sit near Plessy, and that guy was the person that was going to arrest Mr. Plessy, because they wanted to make sure they arrested him for violating the Separate Car Act, because if he's violated if he's arrested for disturbing the peace or something like that, it doesn't work in challenging this law. So he has to be charged with this particular crime. And so they hired an actual private detective to arrest him and charge him with this crime. It's kind of cool. So Plessy's again violated for violating the Separate Car Act. This will get up to the United States Supreme Court again, and Plessy will argue that the law is unconstitutional because 14th Amendment, it violates the equal protection under the law that clause, equal protection clause, because Separate Car Act mandates treating somebody differently because of race, and that's it, right? And the 14th Amendment says that basically you shouldn't be able to do that. And so this makes its way all the way to the United States Supreme Court. You don't have to remember the ruling, but the Supreme Court rules 7-1 against Homer Plessy. One of the justices, I think, excused themselves or something. I don't remember exactly. But one of the justices excused themselves, so it's only an 8 justice decision. The court, again, though, says that states can't, the 14th Amendment says the states can't oppress someone because of race, but it doesn't regulate social discrimination. And so, the railroad has to provide 2 different cars. They're not saying that African Americans can't ride on the train. They're just saying that African Americans have to ride in a separate train car. And so no one's banning them from riding on the train. A lot of legal scholars have argued that Plessy versus Ferguson is one of the worst decisions to come out of the United States Supreme Court. The worst one is that most legal scholars agree is Dred Scott versus Sanford. That one says that African Americans could never be citizens. So, but the United States Supreme Court, and this is really, really, really important, and you need to get this phrase down too. Since separate facilities were available for African Americans, that this is not a violation of the 14th Amendment. And the court's going to establish something, you need to scribble this down, a separate but equal doctrine. Separate but equal doctrine. The United States Supreme Court says you can legally segregate as long as separate facilities are offered. And so the railroad companies are completely cool with what they're doing here. As long as you have a white car and an African American car, that's fine. And so Plessy versus Ferguson establishes that separate but equal doctrine. And so guess what? Southern states especially, some northern ones will jump on this too, but southern states especially are going to embrace this. And so you're going to start seeing, white and black drinking fountains, definitely going to have the continued segregation of school systems. You're going to have segregation of restaurants, basically any sort of accommodations that you have. Drinking fountains, theaters, buses, later on when we have buses. But all this stuff we are going to legally segregate. And something important to state here before we cut is, while separate but equal is the line, none of these facilities were equal. And what's kind of neat is that cartoon there is from a political cartoon from 1905. People in 1905 were like, yeah, these facilities are, holy cow, unequal. They're absolutely not equal. And, very, very much like the slaughterhouse cases and those restrictions on voting rights, this is the situation that we're going to be in for about the next 65 years. So things will turn around later in the class, but for the next 65 years or so, this separate but equal doctrine is going to stand, and that's what we're going to run with. So I'm going to cut us right there, and we'll all pick up right here next week. So see you guys later.